Shalom, and welcome to lesson number 5 of Secrets of the Forgotten Prophetic Scriptures 101. During the fourth lecture, we discussed a little bit of geography, a little bit of cosmology, some deep philosophy, and a smattering of eschatology. This time, we're going to be covering chapters number 25 to 30, which are very eschatological and packed with valuable information about the end times. This information is going to confirm some students' current understanding of eschatology, but very much challenge others. So my recommendation heading into this lesson is to be humble. Stop and pray for meekness if you don't feel it right now. The fact is, we're all on a journey to understand prophecy, and there are going to be times when a course correction is necessary. I personally have had to adjust my charts more than a few times as the Ruach has brought me new information and deeper insights. It's never easy, but it is good. What's not good is when pride keeps us from being willing to admit that we don't have it all figured out yet. On the other hand, if our ideas are confirmed during this study, we should be careful not to give way to arrogance. Knowledge is not equal to godliness. Having the right bearings is good, but it doesn't make us good. What we know is only by the grace of Adonai. So let's follow Paul's lead, who said, "Far be it from me to boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ." Galatians 6:14. After Yahweh tells Baruch that he will be preserved to the consummation of the times, he provides a sign by which we can know that those times are upon us. Quote, "A stupor shall seize the inhabitants of the earth, and they shall fall into many tribulations, and again when they shall fall into great torments." End quote. Chapter 25, verse 3. That sign is actually multi-staged, like a warning light that blinks at an interval. First, there shall be a widespread change of countenance, then many hardships and miseries, then an even worse period of outright torture. By the way, the tribulation spoken of in verse 3 is not the Great Tribulation. The term Great Tribulation describes the last 3.5 years of the age, the second half of Daniel's 70th week, during which Yahweh's people, true Israelites and Messiah, will be hunted and executed nearly everywhere. It's the tribulation of the ecclesia, or assembly of Yeshua. This is how Yeshua defined it during the Olivet Discourse, when he warned, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be." Tribulation isn't a proper noun, but a type of event that has happened many times both to individuals and groups. Middle Eastern Christians, for instance, have undergone many tribulations recently. But unbelievers can be vexed as well, and that's who Yahweh is talking about in 2 Baruch chapter 25. The sign of stupor mentioned in this chapter reminds me of a prophetic message given by Pastor Ken Peters of California. Ken Peters is a minister and traveling preacher who had a vision of the last days when he was a young man in 1980. He was not a follower of Yeshua at the time that he received the vision. He was given the opportunity to share about it at the Prophecy Club almost 20 years later. Mr. Peters seemed very genuine, and everything that he spoke about fits nicely into my understanding of Bible prophecy, so I tend to believe him. One of the things that he witnessed during the vision was that the entire world became forlorn and despondent. Here's a clip from that part of the recording made by the Prophecy Club.
Nearly everyone I experienced had a great look of despair and hopelessness upon their face. Everywhere I went, there was hopelessness. Nobody seemed to be happy about living. I've never experienced that. I've been to a lot of public places where people are bummed out, not happy, not doing well, but not the globe in masses. I don't know, maybe you've seen that. I haven't. So this hysteria brought a complete hopelessness and total perplexity to just about everyone. You have to understand the whole world was experiencing this despair and this chaos that was permeating society. No one, by the way, was isolated from this. No one was hidden from this. This was engulfing the whole globe. I was able to see into different regions, into different continents, and everyone was experiencing this.
Allow me to make a disclaimer here that I am not endorsing the beliefs or ecclesiastical associations of Mr. Peters as they stand today. I honestly don't know much about him, but I think that whatever he practices currently has no bearing upon the validity of the vision that Yahweh granted him back before he was a believer. I think we can find verification of Baruch chapter 25 within the Olivet Discourse, specifically in Luke's version. There we read that earth changes and cosmic changes will greatly disturb the nations. And there will be signs in the sun and moon and stars, and on the earth distress of nations in perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves, people fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world. The kingdom of darkness has been anticipating and even working towards this global fall into calamity. They believe that the current world must fall before a new one can be built, and built in the way that they see fit. Like the occult myth of the phoenix, the previous incarnation must die and a new one rise from its ashes. Once the Goyim have fallen into stupor and tribulations, they will be desperate for relief. Satan will be more than happy to offer that in the form of a false Messiah. Everyone will be primed to accept the leadership of this awe-inspiring genius who will offer answers to the world's problems. Chapter 26 is super short and consists of a single question: for how long will the nations be vexed? Yahweh doesn't directly answer that question until the first verse of chapter 28, but instead takes a moment to explain that the period of tribulations will be divided into 12 parts or aspects. These 12 are detailed in 27, 3 through 13, one aspect per verse. Let's take them in order. The first part is the beginning of commotions. I dare say we've recently entered this phase. Everyone should be able to see at this point we're headed into World War III. In fact, I'm surprised it isn't well underway already, but we are certainly standing on the precipice. Also, natural disasters are getting worse and more frequent, and the powers that be are increasingly blaming it on man-made climate change. I'm sure industrialization has something to do with it, but the interior of the planet and the activity of the sun are also changing of their own accord. The disruption of the natural world will continue to worsen, but over how many years is anyone's guess. Part 2 is the slayings of the great ones. There will be a rash of murders of high-profile individuals. This phrase, great ones, shows up a few times in the Bible, such as Luke 21:25, Revelation 6:15, and Revelation 18:23. And from these instances, we gather that it refers to people of power and renown, especially in the political and economic spheres. So the elites of many nations will be executed and assassinated. Mostly politicians and bankers, I would assume, based upon the prevailing sentiments that we see on social media and internet forums. I find it likely that the common people will rise up due to economic hardship. Part 3 is the fall of many by death. The question is, what kind of death? Well, the sword, famine, and demons are about to be mentioned in association with other aspects, so by process of elimination, my guess is that this death is pestilence. We've already seen some pestilence rearing its head as part of the beginning of commotions, with Ebola, Zika, pneumonic plague, and antibiotic-resistant superbugs all flaring up within the last year. Expect to see one or more of these problems become a global epidemic. The fourth aspect is the sending of the sword, or to put it more simply, war. It may be that this word sending hints at modern warfare methods, since we are now able to deliver ordnance from a distance using technology. You might be wondering whether this sword is sent against a certain region only, such as the Middle East, rather than the whole world. Let's jump ahead a bit to chapter 29, verse 1, to dispel that idea. And he, Yahweh, answered me and said unto me, Whatsoever will then befall the whole earth, therefore all who live will experience them. So, unfortunately, this will be world war. Part 5 of Tribulations involves famine and the withholding of rain. If World War III is a thermonuclear conflict, even in part, that could explain both widespread drought and famine. Famine often results from wars which displace large populations, and a nuclear holocaust would change weather patterns. Also, volcanic activity is increasing, and many people have been having visions of the ring of fire lighting up all at once. Even a single large volcanic eruption is enough to put a blanket of ash into the atmosphere for a year or more, So imagine what dozens of simultaneous eruptions would do to the world, especially in combination with nuclear blasts. Sunlight would be prevented from reaching the surface of the Earth, which means far less evaporation, which means far less rain. Do the parts that we've covered so far seem familiar to you? They should, because they closely parallel the four horsemen of the apocalypse. They aren't in the same order, it's true, but don't let that bother you, because chapter 27 informs us that the 12 parts are not sequential, but the themes are the same: discord, war, famine, and pestilence. Let's keep going. Aspect number 6 is a combination of earthquakes and terrors. We've already seen an uptick in earthquake activity lately, but it will evidently get more severe. Along with this will come terrors, which is a frustratingly vague word. What kind of terrors are these? Your guess is as good as mine. The 7th part, sadly, is missing due to a scribal error. Part 8 is where things start to get supernatural. A horde of specters, or phantoms, will come upon the world. Specters are haunting or frightening spirits. Could this be the locust army from the abyss that we read of in Revelation 9, 1 through 11? These are no normal earthly locusts swarming out of the abyss. Their description leaves no question that these are supernatural beings led by a fallen immortal whose name means destruction. I doubt that the people being stung by these entities will be able to see them or fight against them. Even if the locusts aren't the specters of 27:9, other unclean spirits which come out of the abyss could be. The book of Jubilees, chapter 10, teaches us that 90% of the spirits of the antediluvian Nephilim were locked in the abyss at the behest of Noah. Since then, we've only been contending with 10% of those deceased giants possessing and oppressing humankind. Once the abyss is unlocked, won't all those giants come forth? Thank God we have authority over these beings in the name of Yeshua. Along with these specters will come Shadim that attack the heathen. As we learned in a previous lesson, Shadim are demons that people worshipped through idols. These are fallen immortals that desire sacrifice. In the last days, they will actually attack the Goyim, presumably so as to kill them. Could this be what the Apostle John wrote about in Revelation chapter 9, verses 13 through 18? The 6th angel sounded. I heard a voice from the horns of the golden altar which is before God, saying to the 6th angel who had the trumpet, "Free the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates." The 4 angels were freed who had been prepared for that hour and day and month and year, so that they might kill 1/3 of mankind. The number of the armies of the horsemen was 200 million. I heard the number of them. Thus I saw the horses in the vision, and those who sat on them, having breastplates of fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulfur yellow. And the horses' heads resembled lions' heads. Out of their mouths proceeded fire, smoke, and sulfur. By these 3 plagues were 1/3 of mankind killed, by the fire, the smoke, and the sulfur, which proceeded out of their mouths. These 4 angelic rulers are fallen ones, obviously, or else they wouldn't be bound. They have a terrifying supernatural army at their disposal, and it will slaughter 1/3 of the population of the world. In my mind, that certainly qualifies as an attack of Shadim. In the 9th part, fire falls to earth. This almost certainly corresponds to the first 3 trumpet judgments of Revelation 8, each of which involve fiery objects falling from the heavens. The 10th part will bring rape and much oppression. History teaches us that rape and oppression always follow on the heels of great calamity. People being people, they will selfishly take what isn't theirs in desperate times, including the dignity and freedom of others. In the 11th part, injustice and unchastity. Following economic collapse and world war, many regions likely won't even have a justice system in operation. Civilizations will be shattered, and many places will become lawless, devolving into barbaric clans of dog-eat-dog. The strong will rule tyrannically over the weak, and justice will fall to the ground. As far as chastity is concerned, well, there's been a lack of chastity for a long time, but it has also been getting worse. Every month there's more and more smut in mass media, and there's an avalanche of the stuff online. Imagine a generation that's been raised on such content suddenly being thrown into a lawless world. They'll act like beasts. Chaste means decent, refraining from obscene behavior. Unchaste means embracing obscenity. The Goyim will be full of that in the final years, even more so than now. The 12th and final part is confusion, by which I take it to mean pandemonium and anarchy. There will be widespread disorder because governments have perished or become impotent. Also, there will be emotional and psychological confusion, which harkens back to what we read in Luke about the perplexity of nations. Verses 14 and 15 are commentary from Yahweh on the 12 parts that he just outlined. I'll be frank and say that these verses are very difficult to interpret, and I'm not going to pretend to be able to explain them entirely at this time. Here's what I can extract. These tribulations are going to be interspersed to some degree. They won't happen one after the next in some clearly defined order. They'll often overlap, and some will minister to one another. In other words, the effect of one tribulation will enhance the effects of others. Also, the confusion that goes along with all of this will blind people to the fact that they're living in the final chapter, which ends with the return of Messiah and the healing of the earth. They will not be able to embrace that hope, or even entertain the notion that the Messianic kingdom is on their doorstep, because they'll be convinced that the whole world is ending. They'll think that humanity is doomed because God or the gods or Mother Nature is done with us. But the wise will understand the times, says chapter 28, verse 1. Those of us who have listened to the word of God will know what's happening. This echoes what we read in Daniel 12:10, which says, "The wicked will do wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand." At this point, Yahweh gets back to answering Baruch's question about the duration of the tribulations that will befall the world. The 12 parts will encompass 2 parts a week of 7 weeks. That certainly sounds enigmatic, doesn't it? It is a bit cryptic, but we have the key because the Bible interprets itself. We'll find what we need to know in the Torah, where Yahweh tells the Israelites, "Count for yourselves 7 years of Sabbaths, 7 times 7 years. This set of 7 weeks of years total 49 years for you." Leviticus 25:8. This 49-year period, he goes on to explain, constitutes one Jubilee cycle. Each Sabbath year was considered the end of 1 week of years, and 7 sets of these, or 7 sevens, made up a sacred span of time after which the Israelites must release all debts, indentured servants, and land. In the book of Daniel, we find the angel Gabriel speaking to Daniel in terms of weeks of years like this. In chapter 9, Daniel is told about a set of events that will come to pass over the course of 70 weeks, and we know from how history unfolded that those were weeks of years. Also, the last week of years, which we refer to as Daniel's 70th week, is yet to come and is divided into 2 halves, which the books of Daniel and Revelation both say will be exactly 1,290 days. That leaves no doubt that the weeks of the prophecy given to Daniel are indeed sets of 7 years. Returning to 2 Baruch 28:2, we now realize that the weeks spoken of here are cycles of 7 years, not 7 days each. Knowing that, we may interpret the phrase "a week of 7 weeks" in either of 2 ways. Number 1, 7 sevens times 7, or 343 years. Or number 2, a week made up of 7 weeks, or 1 Jubilee cycle. I greatly prefer the latter interpretation, because we have far less than 343 years left before we enter the 7th millennium, that is, the Messianic age. And we can't count backwards, because the stupor and tribulations described to Baruch in no way began 300 some odd years ago. That would be the early 1700s, and the world has been functioning quite normally since that time. For those reasons, I find it highly improbable that the consummation of the times comprises a period of more than 3 centuries. However, let me offer a disclaimer. It is very unlikely, but technically possible, that our calendar is off by a few hundred years, and that we aren't actually in 2017 yet. If that's the case, then we may indeed have about 343 years left to go. The phantom time hypothesis, yes, this is a real thing, suggests that the early Middle Ages, from 614 to 911 AD, never happened, but were added to the calendar long ago, either by accident, by misinterpretation of documents, or by deliberate falsification by calendar conspirators. However, I don't buy the phantom time hypothesis for a few reasons, foremost of which is that astronomical observations seem to refute it. For now, I'm sticking to the idea that 2 Baruch 28:2 is telling us that the consummation of the times will be a period of 49 years, or one Jubilee cycle. I strongly believe that the first year of the 7th millennium will be a Jubilee year. I also tend to believe the Jewish claim that 1967, the year of Jerusalem's liberation, was a Jubilee year, making 2017 also a Jubilee. That would mean we're presently in the first year of the last Jubilee cycle before Messiah returns. Take that with a grain of salt, though, because no one can prove when the Jubilees are. Chapter 28, verse 2 says something else cryptic, which is that this week of 7 weeks will be reckoned in 2 parts. Not halves necessarily, but divisions. My theory is that one part is 63 years, the other 7 years. It just makes good sense, based on what we read in Daniel 9, to assume that one of the divisions is Daniel's 70th week. We already talked about verse 1 of chapter 29, which tells us that the tribulations will befall the entire earth during the consummation of the times. Now carefully consider verse 2, because it may drastically change your future. Yahweh tells Baruch that he will protect only those of his kingdom who live in the promised land during those times. This verse put me in a bit of a tailspin. My first reaction was, no way. But then, as I thought about it, the statement became uncomfortably plausible. Yahweh calls the promised land my land, but the rest of the world is presently given over to the Goyim. If he's sending plagues and judgments on the Goyim, we should probably not be hanging out on their land. What really brought me to this conclusion was the example of the 10 plagues of Egypt. The inhabitants of Goshen, which were the descendants of Jacob, remained untouched by the plagues. For instance, we read, "I will set apart in that day the land of Goshen in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there. To the end you may know that I am Yahweh on the earth. I will put a division between my people and your people. By tomorrow shall this sign be." Exodus 8:22 and 23. And likewise in the next chapter, "Only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were, there was no hail." Exodus 9:26. Typologically, consider the land of Egypt to be a microcosm of the whole earth. Goshen, which was considered the best land in Egypt for crops and herds, was the area in which Joseph, who was a type of Messiah, settled the Israelites. Goshen was therefore a type of the Promised Land. The Israelites remained safe from the plagues only while they were in Goshen. The Promised Land, by the way, stretches beyond the borders of modern-day Israel. The territory that Yahweh promised to Abraham was from the Nile to the Euphrates, which may look something like this. But of course, the region of Canaan was specifically called out as the area of possession during the time when Joshua took the tribes into the land, so that's most likely what is being referenced in 2 Baruch. I've begun to pray that Abba would show me when and how to get my family to the Promised Land. You may want to seriously consider doing the same. Only when the last Jubilee with its 12 parts is complete will the Messiah begin to be revealed. This is interesting phraseology. Why begin to be revealed? Why not just revealed? Won't Yeshua just show up with the armies of heaven for the last battle? Actually, no. There are 2 phases to his return. Chapter 29, verse 3 invalidates both the pre-tribulation and post-tribulation stances about the rapture, because they claim that Messiah will only be seen at the time when he shows up with the armies of heaven to rescue Jerusalem. Even though pre-tribbers believe that the Messiah will come for his church 7 years before the last battle, they teach that it will be a secret coming and not seen by the unbelieving world. The problem with these theories is that we know from linking together several prophecies that the Messiah will not go back into hiding after showing up for the last battle. He'll stay and reign from Jerusalem as king, and the nations will be brought before him. What this means is that Yeshua must appear to the world at least once before permanently returning to rule. The Ruach led me to this conclusion while I was doing research for my book, Leviathan's Ruse, which was years before I got exposed to 2nd Baruch. A systematic study of Scripture showed me that the day of the Lord begins with the resurrection, aka the rapture. Then the honeymoon and wedding feast of the Lamb take place in heaven, while the wrath of God is being poured out upon the earth. And only after that wedding will the Messiah descend to do battle. In other words, the rapture will be post-70th week, but pre-wrath. When I read 2nd Baruch and saw that it corroborates that understanding, I was pretty thrilled. It is exceedingly clear from the Olivet Discourse that the whole world will see Messiah's glory when he comes and resurrects his ecclesia. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all of the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Matthew 24:29-31. Note that this is after the Great Tribulation, or the last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week. This appearance of Messiah in the clouds is at the start of the 7th millennium, the day of the Lord, and it corresponds with the breaking of the 6th seal in Revelation 6, which you should have read as part of your homework. Did you notice the parallels between that passage and Matthew 24 when you did the reading assignment? The book of Revelation is not chronological, by the way, so don't get discombobulated about the fact that the 6th seal is described so early in the book. Notice that Matthew 24:29-31 never says that Yeshua will set down after he appears in the clouds. Quite the opposite, because he sends out angels to gather his people to himself. The Apostle Paul taught that Yeshua's people will go up to meet him in the air when the last trumpet sounds, 1 Thessalonians 4:16-17. This teaching corresponds with ancient Hebrew wedding custom. In the ancient Hebrew wedding custom, the groom would go to his father's house to prepare a place for the bride for an indeterminate period of time after the betrothal. After that room was complete and the father gave him permission, the groom would then return for his bride in the middle of the night with an entourage. As they approached the bride's home, a trumpet would be sounded and the crowd would shout so that the bride and her family would know that the wedding party was approaching. Then the bride would quickly run outside. She was expected to be prepared at any time for this arrival. Thus the parable of the wise virgins having their lamps lit, being ready for the arrival of the groom. The groom and his party would never make it all the way to the bride's house. She would come out to meet him. And at that point, they would turn around and go back to the father's house, where they would honeymoon in a room called the chuppah for 7 days. This was called the wedding week, or the honeymoon week. After that week, they would emerge from the chuppah, this private place, and the wedding feast would begin. So you see, Yeshua showing up in the clouds and calling his bride up to meet him is so that they can return to heaven. They can go back to the Father's house where a place has been prepared, and they can engage in the honeymoon for a week. That week, by the way, is what Sukkot represents. The 7 days of Sukkot, and the 8th great day being the day on which they emerge and the feast begins. Again, this aerial pickup for the wedding will not occur 7 years before the end, as pre-tribbers believe. It will happen after Daniel's 70th week, after the Great Tribulation, Yeshua said, at the beginning of the day of the Lord, when the bowls of wrath begin to be poured out. The gap between the resurrection and the last battle will only be a few weeks. As if all that we've already discussed wasn't fascinating enough, now we're told, starting in chapter 29, verse 4, that ancient dinosaurs, the king of the sea and the king of the land, will come out of hiding and be slaughtered for food by the survivors of the nations. Yahweh tells Baruch that he has been keeping these creatures safe since the 5th day of creation. Following the resurrection, they will be revealed and eaten. Pretty wild, huh? The book of Enoch also talks about these two beasts coming forth at the end of the age. That day has been prepared for the elect as a covenant, but for sinners as an inquisition. In that day shall be distributed two monsters, a female monster whose name is Leviathan, dwelling in the depths of the sea above the springs of water, and a male monster whose name is Behemoth, which possesses on his breast the invisible wilderness. Then I asked of another angel to show me the power of these monsters, how they became separated on the same day, one in the depths of the sea and one in the dry desert. And he said, "You, son of Adam, are here desirous of understanding secret things." And the angel of peace who was with me said, "These two monsters are by the power of Elohim prepared to become food, that the punishment of Elohim may not be in vain." 1 Enoch 58, 6-12. As an aside, in the book of Job, Yahweh talks about these two creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, describing how spectacular they are, the pinnacle of the animal kingdom. These amazing beasts, which were once a single being, may emerge from seclusion because the second and third bowls of wrath have turned all the waters of the earth to blood. Adonai's people won't be on the scene anymore at that point, and even if they were, they don't eat dinosaurs or any type of reptiles because those animals are unclean. So the ones doing the eating must be goyim. But why is this going to happen, you ask? My theory is that it will function as a divinely imposed juxtaposition. In heaven, a wedding feast will be happening, and the remnant, or the elect, will be enjoying the produce of paradise in divine comfort. We will be drinking wine with Yeshua, who promised, "I tell you that I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom." Matthew 26:29. Simultaneously, on the earth, the survivors, tortured by sores, will be fighting for a portion of the meat of filthy reptiles. Those particular ancient reptiles, one male, one female, one of the land and one of the sea, are mascots for the kingdom of Satan and the cosmocrators. This is a dark reflection of communion. Just as we eat the bread representing the broken form of the lamb, the heathen will eat the meat of the broken form of the dragon. Whereas Yeshua gave himself up willingly, Satan's mascots will be sacrificed unwillingly. For prophecy tells us that on the day of Adonai, Yahweh with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, and Leviathan, the twisted serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea. Isaiah 27:1. The heathen will not be drinking wine during this meal, but blood, for the bowls of wrath will have turned all water on earth into blood. It is written in Revelation 16:5, "And I heard the angel in charge of the waters say, Just are you, O Holy One, who is and who was, for you brought these judgments. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and you have given them blood to drink. It is what they deserve." In other words, these dinosaurs have been prepared for the exact opposite of the Lord's wedding banquet. Let's move on to verse 5. The narrative jumps to describing the copious yield of the vines during the millennium, and how much wine will come from each grape. Baruch is told that the earth during the Messianic age will produce 10,000 times the volume that it had previously. Each grapevine will put out 1,000 branches, each branch 1,000 clusters, and each cluster 1,000 grapes. Compare 1 Enoch 20:19, where in an account of Messianic bliss we find, quote, "The vine that is planted thereon will yield wine in abundance, and all of the seed which is sown thereon will each measure bear 10,000, end quote. Verse 5 claims something phenomenal, which is that each grape will yield a core of wine. A core is about 60 gallons. That's a lot of wine from one grape. Was the Ruach using a hyperbole as he spoke through Baruch and Enoch? Is this just exaggeration? It's possible, but I don't think there's anything in the text to firmly convince us of that. It could be literal. If so, it boggles the mind how big and plentiful things will get during the millennium. It will be like the antediluvian world on steroids. Chapter 30 is dedicated to the resurrection. I know what you're thinking. Didn't the narrative already address the resurrection? Yes, it did. So is chapter 30 sequential or synchronous? I argue the latter. When it says, after these things, the things must be referring back to the 12 parts of the last Jubilee. The alternative doesn't make sense, because the earth isn't going to be healed and be 10,000 times more abundant before Messiah returns in glory. That all has to happen after his return, and thus after the resurrection. What's happening here is that the narrative is stepping back a little bit chronologically to offer more detail about a particularly important event. In verse 2, we read that the resurrection will happen when the Messiah returns in glory at the end of his advent. The advent which began in 3 BC, which is awaiting its fulfillment still. Those who have hoped in him will rise. And, verse 3, as we are assembled in the span of a thought, or the twinkling of an eye, as Paul put it, we will understand that we have reached the consummation and that the time of the wedding has arrived. Verse 4 is another one that supports a post-70th week, pre-wrath rapture. The wicked, it says, will see the righteous dead rise, and when they do, the life that remains in them will drain from their faces. They will be psychologically shattered because they will know without a doubt that the time of wrath has come. They will run and hide in the rocks and caves, says Revelation 6:15 through 17, and beg those rocks to collapse and hide them from the Lamb. They'll be totally demoralized and cowering. Afterward, it will take a mighty effort from the kingdom of darkness to get those people mobilized again. Unclean spirits like frogs will go forth from the mouths of the beast, the false prophet, and the dragon, unto the nations, such as they are at that point, and they will do miracles to convince the heathen that they can fight against Yeshua if he returns. It is in the valley of Jehoshaphat, outside of Jerusalem, that the beast's forces from all over the earth will assemble. I believe that their strategy will be to destroy Jerusalem and all of the descendants of Abraham, so that Yeshua will have no reason to return, or perhaps just to force his hand. Unfortunately for them, Yahweh declared centuries ago that he would protect Jerusalem by trampling the grapes of wrath in the valley outside the city. And the blood will flow as high as the horses' bridles. Revelation 14:20. I know it isn't easy to talk about all the tribulations that are coming upon the world, but it's so good that we know this information now and that we have more to go on than we did before. So as we come into this last Jubilee, I want us to be motivated by the knowledge of what's coming to shine our light even more, to reach out to the lost even more, and to maximize the time. Your assignment for next time is very simple. It's just to read chapters 31 through 35. I'll see you then.